And our final talk for the Unitarian Theology Conference 2017 will be Stephen Lingwood. Stephen is speaking on dialogues of faith and Adamsian approach to Unitarian evangelism. Can Unitarians do evangelism? Stephen is currently minister at Bank Street Unitarian Chapel in Bolton, and from January will become minister and missionary with the Cardiff Unitarians.
Beautiful. So I'm more of a contextual theologian than a philosophical theologian. I'm kind of interested in asking questions of practices, theological questions of practices and things we do or things we might do or things we should do. And so the thing I want to talk about a little bit today is evangelism. Before we get into that, I want to just invite you to take a moment within yourself and think perhaps of a memory, if you can think of one, of when you have experienced evangelism. I'm not going to define it or say exactly what that will mean, or you can think about whether that was a positive or a negative experience. So I just invite you to be with that, with a memory for a moment. And it may be worth revisiting that thought at the end of what I'm going to say. So I'm going to begin by describing three real-life conversations that I have had in recent years. Number one, it was the summer before I started my first ministry. I finished my training and spent the summer traveling in the United States. In New York City, I was staying in a youth hostel, pretty cheap, basic, but in the middle of Manhattan. And I shared a room with bunk beds with a number of other men. And I got talking to one of them. He wasn't a traveller like myself, but he was someone whose apartment was being fumigated. And so he was staying in the hostel for a cheap place to stay for a few days. And he was one of the most interesting people I've ever met, this chap. We began to get talking, and he described to me a moment of conversion he'd had a few years earlier. He had been working in a very well-paid job in a bank. And then he had a moment of kind of snap of conversion, and he gave it up. He moved from LA to New York, and now instead of having a high-paid office job, he worked full-time as a life model. That's all he did all day, was stand naked in a room. Possibly in New York, the only place where there's enough art schools that you can get full-time work being an art model, being a life model. But he was much poorer and much, much happier. And he described to me, that was his life, that's what he'd been through. And we talked about American politics and race and faith. When he found out that I was training, I was just about to begin to be a minister of religion, he expressed to me his own personal spirituality, his own personal approach. He wasn't attached to any particular Orthodox tradition, but he thought a lot about his sense of spirituality and how he tried to live his life. And he explained to me his kind of personal life philosophy. I'm not going to describe that now because actually I have a whole sermon which is what I nicked off him. He gave me his life philosophy and I said, "That's good, can I nick that for a sermon?" And he said, "Yes. Come to me some other time and I'll preach that sermon to you, which is based on his life philosophy, which is based on the film Twister, interestingly enough. But I won't get into that. But it was a conversation that stuck in my mind. It's a conversation that was quite powerful. Number two. What do you think it means to be a Christian then? I was asked. I was sitting in a cafe in Bolton Town Centre. Heavy rain was falling outside. I was having a coffee and a chat with a young woman who'd come to chapel a few times, and we'd arranged to meet up to have a longer conversation than was possible in the usual busyness of a Sunday, just after the service. She'd explored different religions through her life. She'd had an interesting path. And we were there, and she asked me the question of what I thought it meant to be a Christian. And I answered her. I said, I consider myself to be a Christian, to be a liberal Christian, a radical Christian, a Unitarian Christian. And what that means for me personally is that the words of Jesus are a source of profound spiritual teaching, the most profound source I'm aware of. I don't really understand the whole thing about loving Jesus. I don't love Jesus. I don't like him very much, to be honest. But I don't think you always like the best teachers that are good for you, because the best teachers challenge you. And that's what it means for me to be a Christian. That's what I said to her. And she thanked me, and we continued having that conversation about that and lots of other things. 3. Why are you doing this? This was the question I was asked at 2 a.m. one Saturday night / Sunday morning. I was standing on a bustling street in Bolton Town Centre. The thud of dance music was rattling through the windows of the bar next to me, very much like we are here in the centre of Leeds, that sort of atmosphere. The cold night was full of variously dressed, somewhat inebriated folks, taxis making their way through them, the neon lights of the bars and the clubs. I was standing with 2 other people in high visibility jackets with the words Bolton Street Angels emblazoned on our backs. And a friendly soul had stuck up a conversation with us as they made their way to the kebab shop. Why are you doing this? They asked me. And I replied, well, we have different volunteers, and our volunteers will do it for lots of different reasons. But I do it because that's my church over there. I said, pointing to the dark stone building at the side of the road. That's my church over there, and we say our purpose is to engage with the world and to love our neighbour, and this is our neighbourhood, this is our street, so we just want to make sure everyone is safe and well on our street, because that's what it means, that's what's important to us in that church over there. 3 conversations. I've described these real 3-life conversations because I think each of them are examples of evangelism. Or as I would like to put it, evangelical dialogue. They all occur in different contexts, and each of them is different. But in each of these conversations, there is a dialogue of faith, and there is an openness to transformation. And this, I would argue, is the essence of evangelism. Now, evangelism is a word rarely used by Unitarians. And yet, I would argue, and I'm going to argue, that evangelism can be a Unitarian practice, can be a necessary and logical practice growing out of Unitarian theology. And we can do evangelism in a way that is consistent with our foundational theological commitments. So today I want to talk about what evangelism is and how it should be done from a Unitarian foundation. So what is evangelism? To list some common usage, synonymous words and phrases, we might say making religious converts, proselytizing, recruitment, witnessing, sharing one's faith, saving souls, proclaiming the gospel, pushing the faith, peddling the faith, propaganda. Many of these words and phrases have a negative connotation, of course, and many of them don't fit well with Unitarian theology. We Unitarians are much more likely, especially more in recent decades perhaps, or maybe that goes back further than that, I'm not sure, to talk about church growth. We have been talking quite a lot about growth. rather than evangelism, and we might be more comfortable to talk about church growth than talk about evangelism. But the problem with that, however, is that evangelism is not the same thing as church growth. Evangelism is a practice, something we concretely do, which may or may not lead to church growth. Turning to Christian theologians, we find more nuanced definitions of evangelism, such as this one given by missiologist David Bosch, who defines evangelism as the activities involved in spreading the gospel and theological reflection on those activities. Such a definition could be modified by Unitarians and has been. The nearest thing I've found to a recent definition of Unitarian evangelism is by the American John Morgan in the Unitarian Universalist context, who wrote about 20 years ago, "Evangelism is sharing our dream with others in order to transform the world." Sharing our dream with others in order to transform the world. Now that language is softer, but I still believe it's an inadequate kind of language. This definition, along with most others, sees evangelism as primarily proclamation. It is a message given, and it is given in one direction. And yes, evangelism does involve having something to say, but I think from a Unitarian perspective, the idea of proclamation is alone inadequate. Unitarian theology requires us not simply to adopt or soften an orthodox Christian set of words, but rather to begin to open evangelism to looking at it from a different way, which is not to say some Christians aren't looking at it in some of the ways I'm going to talk about today as well. As I'm going to be exploring today, I think Unitarian evangelism must be some form of two-way communication, not simply one-way communication. Evangelism must involve listening as well as speaking. Unitarian evangelism must be a dialogue. It must be a dialogue with the outsider, with a person or group beyond the immediate faith community. And it must also be a faith dialogue, a dialogue where people talk about what matters most to them, that in which they have trust and faith about ultimate concern. So the initial definition of evangelism I want to propose is that evangelism is a faith dialogue with the outsider where there is an openness to transformation. And what this means will become clearer as we consider this in more depth. So firstly, I want to ask the question, how should we do evangelism ethically? A friend of mine recently described to me an experience of Mormon missionaries at her door. She said they were polite and they were friendly, and she had a good talk with them for about 10 minutes. They invited her to a church event. She politely turned them down, saying she wasn't really religious, she wasn't really interested. And the conversation continued. They invited her to another event. And again, she had to turn them down and say, no, thank you. And eventually, she said she had to be insistent. She took a leaflet, but firmly ended the conversation and firmly closed the door. And as she later described this conversation to me, she said that although they were polite, she felt the missionaries were pushy and did not take no for an answer. And ultimately, she felt they might be manipulative in the way they were operating, in who they might encounter in what they're doing, in who they might prey on, if we want to use a very negative word. And I'm very sympathetic to those objections. Many people are critical of evangelism because they have experienced evangelism being done badly. They have experienced evangelism that is coercive, aggressive, hypocritical, non-consensual, emotionally manipulative, and intellectually dishonest. It may be, as you consider your experiences, as I invite you to think of an experience of evangelism, that might have been the kind of things that came to mind for you. But what I want to argue today is that this does not make evangelism in itself an unethical practice. It simply means evangelism is often done in a less than ethical way. This is a nuance that is rarely discussed in literature about evangelism. or in an academic sense, and also in a common day kind of conversational sense. Writers on evangelism either tend to believe it is unquestionably, obviously, a bad thing, or some writers, Christian writers on evangelism, perhaps others, unquestionably assume it is a good thing. Whereas I think if you think about it in any depth without prejudice, I think you've got to come to the conclusion that it could be a good thing, but it can also be a pretty awful thing. And that we must make a clear distinction between ethical evangelism and unethical evangelism, between good evangelism and bad evangelism. Fortunately, the ethicist Elmer Tyson, I think that's how you pronounce that, in his book, The Ethics of Evangelism, has already really pursued this question, and I recommend that book because he really looks into that question of what is ethical and unethical evangelism and explores that. And I basically agree with everything he says in that. And with that need to distinguish between ethical evangelism and unethical evangelism. So what makes good evangelism? And in some ways, this is a fairly easy question to answer because there are commonly agreed standards of ethics that can be applied fairly easily to the practice of evangelism. Good evangelism is honest and truthful. It respects the integrity of individuals, is not abusive or manipulative, and contributes to human flourishing. Fairly common agreed standards of human behavior that we can agree on, I think. And it's not difficult to apply them to evangelism and to call out anything that doesn't meet those standards as an unethical practice of evangelism. So, having set out those basic standards, ethical standards of evangelism, to which I would want to hold all people in society to, all people engaging in evangelism, all people, I think we can have a right to hold people to those standards. I'd like to go further in now in kind of exploring what evangelism might mean if we do it from a Unitarian foundation, which is minimally the ethical standards that I've kind of set out, but more than that as well. Now, in pursuing this question, I want to argue that means and ends should be in harmony. This is a point made by theologian Brian Stone in arguing that the Christian gospel is one of peace. Therefore, the practice of evangelism should be a peaceful and non-violent one. Stone argues, he says, Christian evangelism refuses every violent means of converting others to that peace, whether that violence is cultural, military, political, spiritual, or intellectual. This echoes words of Martin Luther King Jr. that we should pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. Peace is not merely a goal, it is the way we reach that goal. Equally, the very nature of Unitarianism needs to show us how we should be carrying out the practice of Unitarian evangelism. So how can we understand the nature of Unitarian faith? One of the most comprehensive answers to that question that I often turn to is a very useful essay by the American Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams. Although I met George Kimmich Beach last year, and he told me something I didn't realise, that actually the 5 Smooth Stones essay by James Luther Adams actually was really created by the editor putting together various bits of James Luther Adams' words into that. So the structure actually didn't come from Adams, but it's still a good structure. And I think Adams approved of it, but it wasn't entirely his structure that he was put forward in that essay. So the 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism, according to Adams and those who edited his work, were that, number 1, revelation is continuous. Number 2, relations between persons ought to rest in free consent and not coercion. 3, the need to work for a just and loving world. 4, the need for ideas to be incarnated in concrete communities. And 5, an ultimate attitude of hope. And to these, I would like to add a 6th today, which is also very key to the thought of James Luther Adams, though it's not in that particular essay. And I'd add number 6, the need for transformation or radical change. Now, I believe these 6 principles provide a powerful foundation for Unitarian evangelism, and each of them can be used to concretely suggest how we should do evangelism as Unitarians. They provide us, if we want to say it in a theological essay kind of a way, with an Adamsian approach to Unitarian evangelism. So we're going to go through these 5 now. Number 1, that revelation is continuous. Revelation is not sealed. What that means is all our religious language is partial and capable of being adapted in the light of new understanding. Therefore, I think Unitarian theology must be rooted in the idea that we continuously discover revelation, rather than the idea simply that we have received the revelation and now must proclaim the revelation, the gospel. So simply promoting our ideas, ourselves, our faith, our church alone is inadequate. Rather, our commitment to continuous and imperfect revelation means evangelism is not just giving something to the outsider in the assumption that I have it and they don't, but rather seeking something together by entering into dialogue. The commitment to searching, not just giving, means the appropriate word is dialogue. Unitarian evangelism is a dialogue. 2, relations between persons ought to rest in free consent and not coercion. That freedom and mutual consent, both in the church and in society, is what we commit to. Free inquiry and freely chosen commitment are the best basis for discerning religious truth and forming religious community. Coercion has no place in Unitarian evangelism. Evangelism is an open invitation to dialogue and is refusable. It is only in the context of freedom, non-coercion, and non-violence that evangelism can take place. Concretely, this means, for example, that evangelizing someone in a hospital bed would be unacceptable because that person cannot escape the conversation. Free inquiry and mutual consent also implies and requires a standard of honesty. This means that evangelism must be carried out with complete honesty and openness. Evangelism must be about truth-telling. So, for example, inviting someone to a social event, to saying, "I'll come along to a bingo or a quiz night we're having," and then you get to the bingo or the quiz night and actually someone gets up and starts pushing a message at you, that's unethical because there was a dishonesty in inviting you to one kind of event when in fact, in reality, it was something quite different. There was a dishonesty in that process. Now, perhaps we think we don't do that kind of thing. And yet there are issues, I think, around truth-telling that we need to think about. Our reluctance sometimes to name ourselves as religious or to label ourselves as a church could be a form of dishonesty. We seem to be seeking to remove labels that we think might be off-putting to others. But when we do so, we must ultimately ask the question, are we actually lying? Are we false advertising? A corporate business or a political party may think it's okay to manipulate the truth or to put a spin on things for the good of the cause, that the ends justify the means, but I would say that is not an option for us. Equally, I would say that when we say things like Isaac Newton, Charles Dickens, or Charles Darwin were Unitarians, at the best we're being very loose with the truth, and I would argue we may be in fact lying. Again, I must emphasize that our means should be in harmony with our ends. Unitarian evangelism must not lie. We must remain committed to truth. 3, the need to work for a loving and just world. We affirm that there is a moral necessity of committing to creating just and loving communities. Rooted in that conviction of the Hebrew prophets, Unitarians affirm that a ritualistic faith that is only concerned with worship, does not relate to the social conditions of society, is perverted. So evangelism must be understood as one part of a mission, not the whole of the mission, only one part of the mission of seeking a loving, just and beautiful world. What evangelism is a dialogue of faith, and that's different from works of love and justice. But we shouldn't sharply compartmentalize these things. In the case of my encounter while being a street angel in Bolton, it was because we were committing to simply helping people that there was an opportunity for an evangelical conversation. Someone asked why I was doing what I was doing. And the honest answer I gave was because of my faith. And so that was a moment of evangelism. But the reason for helping people cannot be to have that conversation. That again would be manipulative and dishonest to offer some service for an ulterior motive. We help people, we do works of love and justice because we believe it is the right thing to do. And that's what we should stick to. But if someone asks what motivates us, it's perfectly appropriate and perfectly honest to talk about faith. Fourthly, as Adam so beautifully put it, Unitarians deny the immaculate conception of virtue and affirm the necessity of social incarnation. This means tradition and community are inescapable in pursuing truth and essential in pursuing justice. It is only groups, perhaps small groups, that change the world. The commitment to social incarnation means that evangelism must be rooted in the life of community. In other words, it must relate to the church. It must be, in some sense, ecclesiological, to use a theological term. Again, Brian Stone writes, evangelism is the practice of giving the world something to see, to touch, and to try. And the world should see, quote, a community of discipline in which the Spirit can be discerned. Such a community of discipline demonstrates, according to Stone, a distinct set of habits, practices, disciplines, and loyalties that together constitute a visible and recognizable pattern before a watching world. So I would say this pattern includes a coherent set of stories, practices, and virtues, such as love, hospitality, forgiveness, and non-violence. These virtues cannot be fully demonstrated in the life of an individual, but must be practiced in the context of a community. So a dialogue of faith must be a dialogue about faith community. Faith cannot be fully lived or demonstrated in isolation. Though, of course, individual moments of dialogue, of evangelism, may only include two people in dialogue, but at least implicitly, evangelism features an invitation to community. I'm doing this because I belong to that church, I said to the Inquirer when I was a street angel, literally pointing to my community. I didn't invite him to come along on Sunday morning. It wouldn't have worked if I had. But I was explicit that my faith and my values were shaped by a religious community, and that indeed the service project he was encountering was only possible because of the support of such communities. This is one thing not understood, for example, by the Unitarian van missionaries that were around in the early 20th century. The van missionaries travelled around the country in a horse-drawn van, came into a town, preached the message, and then left. And the message never really had any strength because it wasn't being incarnated in real community. So this was a largely ineffective Unitarian evangelistic effort. And any modern attempt at publicity, Unitarian publicity, disconnected from the witness of local communities, is likely to be equally as ineffective. Fifthly, Unitarians hold an attitude of optimism in the possibility of a world of justice and peace becoming a reality within history. This is indeed our good news. Though we affirm the continuity of revelation, that does not mean that we have no commitments, no positions, no story, no good news of our own. We do. Unitarian faith, I would argue, is faith in the goodness, in the meaningfulness, in the beauty and holiness of life. Unitarian faith claims that life is a blessing and not a curse, that there is a beauty and a holiness that surrounds us, that our purpose is not to escape this existence but to live into it more deeply, that we are intimately connected to a holiness that binds us all together, even that this holiness is a loving reality that inspires us to love. We do not believe the world is doomed or going to be abandoned in some divine plan for another realm. There's a sense that the world is good, despite and acknowledging the suffering, the darkness it contains. There is reason to hope. Six, the need for transformation or radical change. Faith is a demand for conversion, not merely at the moment of taking on a new faith, but continuously. This sort of conversion or transformation, in Greek metanoia, was discussed a great deal by James Luther Adams. He wrote, "Metanoia is to be understood as a change of heart, mind, soul, total personal orientation." Adams saw the mission of the church as calling people to continuous conversion, continuous commitment to faith. Adams wrote, "Religion properly understood is not a sanction for easy inspiration or easy conscience, but rather the source of radical questions regarding our behavior, not only as individuals but also as members of collectives and corporations." Adams gave this view of the mission of the Unitarian Church. He said, "The free church is that community which is committed to determining what is rightly of ultimate concern to persons of free faith. When alive, it is the community in which men and women are called to seek fulfillment by the surrender of their lives to the control of the commanding, sustaining, transforming reality. It is the community in which women and men are called to recognize and abandon their ever-recurrent reliance on the unreliable." So what form of Unitarian evangelism emerges out of this commitment to transformation? Should a Unitarian evangelist call people to repent? Well, no, not exactly. Such a proclamation, as we usually hear it, is usually built on a sense of certainty, verging on arrogance, that the evangelist has it right and everyone else has it wrong. The Unitarian evangelist has no such certainty and does not want to display such arrogance. But the process of evangelism opens us to transformation. What does that mean? It means we enter into dialogue seeking truth, seeking salvation, and are open to where that seeking will take us. And so we may enter into a dialogue thinking we have found some faith, some saving faith, something worthy of commitment, something of ultimate concern that transforms us. We cannot prove that our faith is more authentic than any other faith, but we are willing to enter into dialogue. When we enter into dialogue, we do not know the outcome of this process. The dialogue may lead, to possibly three main outcomes, maybe more. But if we are two people of some faith, and I believe everyone has some faith in because everyone has a foundation that they live their lives by, it may be that you are transformed, You are changed and want to then join my faith community. Or it may be that I am transformed and I change and I decide to join your faith community. Or it may be that we're both transformed in some other way that does not involve us changing our affiliations, as it were. The point is, when we enter into evangelical dialogue, we do not know what the outcome will be. And I believe this shows the inadequacy of defining evangelism as trying to convert someone to your faith. Such conversion is ultimately beyond our control. The liberal evangelist has to be open to the possibility of being proved wrong when entering into dialogue. I can enter into dialogue with a Muslim, and I have to be totally open to the possibility that I will discover that the Quran really is the fullest and final revelation of God, and that I should become a Muslim. I can enter into dialogue with a secular atheist, and I have to be totally open to the possibility that I will discover that all religion is nonsense and harmful, and that I should do something more useful with myself. I enter into dialogue. I speak, I listen, and I'm open to transformation. I do not know, and I can never know, in what form that transformation may take. But I think what we discover is that ultimately, in that moment of dialogue, we do discover truth, and we are led into deeper lives, into transformed lives. So I'm coming to a conclusion now. And I want to repeat something I said earlier, that evangelism and church growth are not the same thing. That evangelism is a particular practice that may or may not lead to church growth. It should indeed grow out of a sense we have something to say to the world, that we have a hope within us that is worth exploring, that we have discovered something reliable and are happy to search to make sure we are rooted in something reliable and not something unreliable. But as liberals, we have to be open to the possibility of discovering something new, to always discovering that we are wrong. And in this sense, evangelism may lead to church decline if we can become convinced that Unitarianism is wrong. That is absolutely a possibility. So we enter into evangelical dialogue not because we want church growth, but because we want truth. We want transformation. So being committed to evangelism means we live our lives in such a way as to be open to the opportunities for such conversations and such transformation. Now, congregations can create opportunities for these kinds of conversations. But most of these conversations happen in a spontaneous way. It may be that ministers like myself find those opportunities by virtue of saying, I am a minister. But it's something everyone can do and something that everyone does do. If we enter into truly authentic, open conversation with a person about ultimate concern, we are doing evangelism. We may find ourselves listening more than speaking, and that is still evangelism. We may be in the street, in a church, or in a pub. And it's all evangelism. And it may change us as much as it changes anyone else. That's what evangelism does. Evangelism is a dialogue of faith where we open ourselves to transformation. Evangelism is a practice of dialogue where we are prepared with risk and vulnerability to speak and to listen to one another, but with a sense of trust that in such moments of dialogue, lives can be transformed. And I just want to be clear here as well that this isn't about having clever arguments this isn't about winning an argument. It's about authentically speaking the truth of your life. It's about witnessing to what is in your soul and creating a space where others can do the same. And so what I think this looks like, and what I'd invite you to what I'd want to try and shift your mind in thinking about what evangelism looks like. I think it looks like the novel The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. There's a film of it as well. In this film, the main character, Sally, begins the story with a hugely diminished sense of personhood through her experience in life. And it's through the encounter with another, it's through the encounter of Shug Avery, through their conversations, through the encounter of one human being to another, that Sally opens up to a wider experience of God and grows in her faith in her own divinity, her own humanity within her. Through that encounter, through that conversation, through that dialogue with someone else, she discovers a deeper faith. And I think that's what good evangelism looks like. I think that's what Unitarian evangelism might look like. I think when there is those conversations, those encounters, where we are truly open to one another, those moments are pregnant with holiness. And so I am trying to commit, and I invite you all to be committed to creating spaces for such conversations to happen. Thank you.
I've been a member of the Labour Party all my life. When I enter into a dialogue with a Conservative, I'm not open to be converted to conservatism because my whole life has taught me that that's not right. I spent my whole life working out what my religious point of view is, and I've gone from lots of different views. Should I, when I enter into a dialogue, say, with a Muslim, should I be open to convert to Muslim? I'm not sure I can feel I could really be in that position. I can try to understand what they're saying, but can I be open to be converted? I found that quite difficult, the point you made.
I think ultimately you do have to be. We are, deeply committed to the things we're committed to, in terms of faith and politics. I mean, it's interesting to think about that parallel. Of course we are. These are deep things. Ultimately, though, I think I'd argue as Unitarians, our loyalty has to be ultimately to truth. And if your ultimate loyalty is to the truth, in a parallel with science, I suppose, you need to be ultimately always open to the possibility that your theories might not turn out to be correct. You can advocate for what you are, what is true to you, but I think there's a risk in encounter that you do get proved wrong. Well, not proved wrong, maybe the wrong way of putting it, but that you change.
Stephen, you mentioned the van mission. I think that was around before the First World War and maybe after slightly for a few years. Then we got the concept that Unitarians don't proselytize. In your research, have you come across any evidence as to why the concept of proselytization ended with the van mission, or did it not?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to note words like proselytization, proselytize. We only tend to use that word negatively without defining what that means. I mean, in Elmer Tyson's book, he uses that word throughout. The title of the book ends up being evangelism. I think that's an editor's choice, but actually he talks about good proselytism all the way through. But I think that word is irredeemable, I think, because I think societies agree that means something bad. So again, I think distinctions between good evangelism and bad evangelism, rather than putting a label on, we don't proselytize. But the historical question, if we say we don't do evangelism or we don't do mission, we do, and we have a lot actually. You can start with Richard Wright in the early 19th century, wandered the country evangelizing Unitarianism. And the domestic missions, so we had Richard Wright, wandering missionary. We had domestic missions. We had the Home Missionary College. We had districts that are originally missions. We have van missions. So certainly from the beginnings of Unitarianism in this country up to 1910, there wasn't a period where we weren't doing Unitarian mission. Oh, and also mission to India as well, on a very small scale, but there were Unitarian missionaries in India trying to convert Hindus. So this isn't something this is something we have been involved in. Did we stop? I don't know. Perhaps I suppose it's generally the decline of Unitarianism begins sort of 1910, 1920, the decline of nonconformity, and there's a lack of confidence, perhaps at that point. I haven't studied that to give a good historical answer to that. But I would note that when we start in the late 20th century talking about church growth, it's a lot less ambitious than what we've been doing before. Before we were going out to where people were in domestic missions and things like that. And when we start, even in the 1980s, we start talking about trying to get people in our doors, and that's not what Unitarian mission was in the 19th century. It was going to where people were, not trying to get them into our doors.
Thank you. Hi. This is kind of a response to John's point. I hope that's okay. It seems to me that in saying, in asking the question, if I enter in dialogue with a Muslim, should I be open to the possibility that I will be decided to convert to Islam? You are assuming it is not possible to be both a Muslim and a Unitarian. And I know that to be untrue, just in the same way that it is perfectly possible to be a Unitarian and a pagan, a Unitarian and a Buddhist, a Unitarian and a Christian. And I guess this is, maybe I'm jumping ahead to the reviewing the whole conference bit that I know is about to come up, but so I would like to throw that out there. Are we still a Christian movement? And I've heard Mike Hogue in the UU context defining Unitarian Universalism as post-Christian but radically Protestant, and also in the spirit of the anniversary of the Reformation. I'd just like to throw that out there for people's consideration.
Yes, thanks. And perhaps we could pick that up in the more general panel. I don't know if you have any response now, Steve.
I might not stop if I start on that one, so let's move on.
Okay. James.
Thank you. I love what you've had to say, and I think it's so important that we're not the foot in the door. And just looking around this church, you can see lots of information that people can either read if they want to, or if they don't want to read it, they don't. And this is what I love about the internet, is the fact that we can put stuff up there and people in their own leisure, in their own time, can view it if they want to, or they don't have to. There's no coercion there. But I'd just like to ask, are we proselytizing because we're a creedless faith? I don't see it as proselytizing. I see it more as just communicating to tell people what we stand for, not really with an idea of making them change their views, but more because most of the conversations I have, people say, I've never heard of you guys, what do you stand for? So it's a much more basic informational level rather than actually something sort of deeper. If they want to carry on with it, then they'll go deeper later on. But I just wonder whether are we proselytizing because we're a creedless faith? I'd have thought, is there a contradiction there?
There may be a level of providing information. The problem is the subject matter we're dealing with. I don't think it's possible to talk about faith without getting deep in the soul and without in some way advocating your faith. I think if you're talking about what is the foundation of you, and I'm talking about human encounter, that's not just providing information, that's opening your soul a little bit. And so I think what I would call evangelism is not just providing information, it's something else. But the minimum of it is providing information, I suppose.
Andrew, were you indicating? No.
I just wanted to refer back to your reference to domestic missions, in that the domestic mission movement was not started with the purpose of evangelizing. It was started with the purpose of discovering that the people of the new populations, the inner cities, had no church associations whatsoever, and that most of our domestic missions were never intended to have a religious congregation attached to them in the first place.
Well, yeah. I'm not.
Okay, and then we'll take John, maybe the final question, actually. Sorry, do you wish we take John and then...
Oh, yes, that's fine, yeah.
Henry Nelson Wyman talks about the dual level of commitment in religion, where you commit yourself to what you firmly believe to be correct, but you must have a deeper commitment to being transformed if you find out that it isn't correct. So you have a dual loyalty. I'm just wondering if, and he identified that creative transformation process with God, okay, it was God working through, that was part of that. That I'm thinking of a couple of phrases. One is, don't reinvent the wheel. And the other is, one reason we can see so far is because we stand on the shoulders of giants. When you go into this kind of dialogue, you're not going in with an empty barrel, asking someone else to fill it. You know, you're going in with some deeply held beliefs and commitments. And so I think that there is a sense in which we do proclaim the importance of equality. We proclaim the danger that our world is under with pollution and global warming and all these other things. We make proclamations because this is what we believe. And I can't imagine entering into a conversation with the American clown that occupies the highest office in the country with a mind that is open to being converted to his simplistic, not to say crude, way of thinking. So does this mean that there's no possibility of dialogue with that attitude?
Yeah, it's a really good point. There's something about the responsibility of who we are when we enter into dialogue, and we don't know we're not responsible for how the other parties enter into dialogue, and there may be a point where the other body is not entering into dialogue in a way which is actually conducive to dialogue, in a way which may ultimately be violent. I mean, you know, it gets sort of in a practical way. There may be a conversation you'll be having with someone in which you think, I'm now fearing for my life, so I'm going to extricate myself from this conversation because this is, so that there is a kind of a level of self-care in that as well. I suppose there's some trust that the other party is entering into with some kind of openness as well. And if they aren't, then it may not be possible to enter into true dialogue if it's not somewhat mutual. And if you got a reference for the Wyman stuff, I've not got too much into Wyman. I would be interested in that actually, because I've not had time to get into him as much as I wanted to. About domestic missions, I think is an interesting point. I'm not sure I entirely agree with Andrew. I think the way the documents I've seen talk about domestic missions talk about quickening piety and sort of encouraging religion in a general sense. And that goes back to one of the issues around Unitarian evangelism historically, is that are we promoting Unitarianism, which Richard Wright was, I think. The domestic missionaries were probably really saying we're promoting Christianity, not necessarily Unitarianism. We're promoting sort of a general Christianity. Are we promoting Unitarianism? Are we promoting Christianity in general? Are we promoting religion in general, which I think becomes a question with the mission to India? Is it actually Christianity we're promoting in India, or are we just promoting kind of rational liberal religion, which is sort of what happened with the Brahmo Samaj, became a more monotheistic, rational, liberal Hinduism? So is that what we were trying to do? So there is always a question of how much we're promoting something specific or how much we're promoting something in general, which gets more and more general and harder to get your arms around. I don't know if that's a very good concluding point, but...
Yeah, I think that's a good point to leave it, actually. Thanks once again to Stephen for a very stimulating talk.